So
I think it's a duplicity. Like, it's not this situation. Like, we tend to victim blame in all this and say, well, you didn't read the car policy. And we fail to realize that companies are going out of their way to obfuscate what they're doing with our data. Governments are going out of their way to obfuscate how they're collecting data. They're deliberately hiding this from us, because if this would have just come out and them to say, hey, we're taking all of your personal information, we're giving it to Larry to review, he's looking over it and he knows exactly where you are at all times of the day, there'd be outrage. And so it's deliberately being hidden from us. I mean, one of the things in financial privacy specifically, when the Bank Secrecy Act came out, one of the things that was pushed back against is, well, if you're going to be collecting all this information, we at least need to tell consumers about it. And so this other act was passed, and it was written into it that you got to tell consumers. Then in 1992, the Anuncio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act basically got rid of all of that. It made it illegal for your bank to tell you if they're filing a suspicious activity report. And now a suspicious activity report applied to anything they deemed suspicious. That was kind of like, oh, well, it was kind of close to $10,000, or she made several transactions in a day, or I didn't like the way she looked in the color yellow. Whatever they want to do, they file these reports. It's illegal for banks to now tell people when they file these reports. And so hundreds of millions of reports are generated on Americans for basically nothing more than using their own money. And we don't know about it. We don't quite realize the extent to which this has crept into our lives.
There was, I don't know if this was on your radar, Naomi. So it's tricky with stuff like this, because a lot of times the case, like the civil liberties violations or whatever, are with unsavory people. And so they're not very sympathetic victims. But it was a guy that he was like a wrestling coach. And apparently the allegation is that, he was doing stuff a long time ago, but then he was being blackmailed and he was paying the blackmailer. And what they actually nabbed him on and, convicted him on was the structured with, like, he was withdrawing just below the reporting limit so that his bank wouldn't have to, he was withdrawing the money to go pay the blackmailer who knew about, these allegations about him and, some kid he was coaching as a wrestling coach decades earlier. So again, it was not a very sympathetic way, but I saw some people saying, this is kind of weird that technically this guy's going to jail because the government showed that he just withdrew his own money from the bank, right? Like, in other words, they didn't prove that he did anything decades ago. He's going to jail because he took his own money out and was just apparently deliberately just stopping short of the requirements so that he wouldn't leave too obvious of a paper trail. And that seems kind of weird that you can go to jail for taking your own money out of your bank account.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. Basically, the government got lazy, right? And they made the movement of this money the crime, not the actual crime itself. It's like saying, like, you used a water bottle and nabbing people for that, when the actual crime was you killed someone and the weapon happened to be a water bottle. It's like, you don't put people in jail for using water bottles. Right. But somehow we've associated payment activity with the actual crime itself. And money laundering became this invented crime because governments realized that they had complete control over the monetary system. They have a monopoly over the creation of money, or so they thought, because they were routinely shutting down any alternatives that would pop up until crypto came along and they couldn't shut it down. And so thinking that they had full control over the system, they realized that they could coerce banks to shut down payments to certain causes they didn't like. They could coerce credit card companies and money transmitters to do the same thing. They could really control people's behavior using this financial system. And it was completely surveilled. Everything's monitored. All of this data is reported back. So it's incredibly insidious how the monetary system was weaponized over time. And then they said, well, money laundering is the crime, so we're going to use this to follow the trail of money. And it's how they catch the bad guys. And let's be honest, like, we want bad guys to be caught, right? But they made the actual movement of the money the crime instead of the crimes itself, which means that now all of these innocent people are left wide open to pervasive mass surveillance into the most intimate details of their life in a world where the Constitution is meant to be protecting us from this overreach. We have the Fourth Amendment for a reason. The government is not meant to get access to all of our information without a warrant. Yet here we are, that everything we do in the financial world is surveilled, and the government uses that as a weapon to go after people arbitrarily. Let's face it, this is arbitrarily enforced to go after people that the government wants to build a case against, and when they can't find any other evidence against them. So it's a pretty scary situation if you take it away from bad people and say, oh, well, can this be used against someone who's leading a political movement they don't like, who has a religious affiliation they don't like, who supported a candidate or sent money to a family member, or just something that the government deems problematic to them? Can they use this weaponized monetary system? And yes, they absolutely can, and they do it all the time.
Yeah, just to go back to what you said earlier, that it's not merely the moving of the money, but then like the actions built on top of that. So the example you gave was that they made it so that it was illegal for the banks to even tell their customer, by the way, you just did X, Y, Z, and so we had to send in a suspicious report, just so you know. Like, they couldn't do that. And so a comparable thing, I had a newsletter with my co-author Carlos Lara years ago, Naomi, and we were giving a strategy to our subscribers as to what we thought they should do based on the economic environment. And one of the things was, hey, you should build up a decent stockpile of actual currency, enough to get you through like a month's of expenses, ideally, just because, there could be a banking crisis, we're going through. But then I realized, and I'm talking to him, and I said, should we mention, though, that if this is a lot of money, that might trigger a report, that if you go in and start withdrawing large amounts, that, they might file a report. But then for my research, I learned that, oh no, we could get in trouble as newsletter writers if we told them, hey, it's our understanding that this is the threshold, and if you go into your bank and try to take out more than this in one day, they're going to fight. That we could be breaking the law by just telling our readers that true fact about the we just. Well, I mean, it was amazing. How we had to thread the needle, because we didn't. Anyway, you get the point. And I guess the ostensible reason is, we don't want to tip the bad guys off, so they structure. But anyway, so go ahead.
I mean, one interesting anecdote is that I think it's the number 2 reason because we get very limited insight into all of this. Mm-hmm. But the government is meant to produce reports that kind of talk about this. They rarely do it. The last report we had was from many years ago. But insight that we did gain from this report was that I think it's the number 2 reason. The most common reason for filing a suspicious activity report is not that they went over the $10,000 limit. It's that they were near the $10,000 limit. So why bother having a threshold when it's both illegal and suspicious to go over it as well as under it? Why bother having it, And just understanding that now SARs don't even apply to $10,000. It's anything that the bank deems suspicious. And keep in mind that the banks have basically been conscripted as government surveillance agents in this. They're not being compensated for this. It costs them, I think it's like $46 billion a year to do all of this surveillance. And all of those costs are getting passed on to consumers. So not only is your privacy being invaded, but it's also costing you a ton of money on top of that. So all of this surveillance is costing us a ton of money. I believe that it's unconstitutional, and it just sidesteps the 4th Amendment that we have in place. It's costing us a ton of money. Also, I mean, the biggest point from all of this is that banks have a liability issue as being these conscripted agents of the state now. If they're found to have not filed a suspicious activity report when they should have, then they could get in trouble now. So you find that banks are just being overzealous in how many reports they're filing. They want to go above and beyond, give the government the entire haystack to find that needle, because if they miss that one needle, they're going to get in trouble. And so the amount of financial reporting, it's basically just banks handing over our data in bulk to the government at this stage. And this was even confirmed it was last year, I believe. They tried to implement this $600 rule where they said any bank account that has $600 worth of activity in it in a year, now that was subject to federal scrutiny, and all of that data had to be sent to the government. $600 in a year is insane. Anyway, there was pushback against this, obviously, and people said this is insanity. You can't have that much visibility. And the government replied and said, why are you guys so upset? We already get all of this data. Mm-hmm. And everyone responded was like, guys, you just said the quiet part out loud that you are already collecting all this data. They walked it back somewhat, but really not much at all, because they just said, okay, we won't apply it to all bank accounts. We'll just apply it to those where a payment transmitter is involved. So like PayPal, Venmo, Cash App, all of those things. If there's $600 worth of activity going through those things, then we report all of that activity to the government. So we're in a situation now where the government freely admits that they are getting all of our data in bulk. They have unfettered insight into all of our financial activities. And that's problematic because our financial activities give people great insight into our lives. It shows our patterns, our habits, our preferences, which causes we support, where we align on the political spectrum, all things that could be used against us, all things that might deem us as problematic citizens who maybe are dissidents or protesters or someone who might cause trouble for the government. So all of this stuff is information that we should have the right to keep private based on constitutional protections, and we just have no privacy at all.
Yeah, just along that point, I bought a house in 2022, and as part of the process to get the mortgage and all that, they wanted to see whatever it was, 3 or 6 months of checking account statements going back, and I was just going through, and I was like highlighting or using a black marker to like make sure no account numbers or anything where it was going. But I was just looking at it saying, you know a lot about my personal life just from looking at these printouts of, my how I use my debit card. And so, yeah, the fact that anybody could just go snooping. And also to go back to what you said, I think there is a temptation for people to say, oh, come on. Yeah, but since they're taking this from everybody, it's a huge thing. I'm not going to stand up. But that's not the point. The point is if they want to lean on you for some other reason, then they can scrutinize this huge trail of information they have about you, and they can find something because there's so many rules, and you probably are doing something wrong, and they can lean on you, or something that's embarrassing that they could say, "Oh, geez, we would be ashamed if your coworker saw you said this about him in this other email or this text message, right?" And so
yeah, it's when people say that they have nothing to hide, is that idea that they're basically proclaiming that they in lockstep with the government and just abide by whatever the government says and never plan to ever disagree with the government ever, which is a terrible bet to make based on a history of government just creating a slew of bad policies throughout history. So you're betting that you're never going to disagree with anything the government ever says in future, that you're never going to have something to hide, that they're always going to have the best policies, nothing you want to push back on as a conscientious citizen and say, no, this isn't right, let's have better laws. I mean, I wouldn't proclaim that because I think that's not something to brag about, that you're so complacent that you don't think that you will ever be an activist and be unhappy about a situation. And we have to realize that governments come and go and regimes come and go and social norms change, but our data is forever. And as you rightly said, they just need to access this treasure trove of information that they have about us and find anything that might embarrass us and put pressure on us. And all that needs to happen for them to be motivated to do so is we say something in disagreement that they don't want us to say.